Please be seated. I'm going to skip our Old Testament reading, which was Genesis 39, not 37. That's probably my mistake, because I'm good at that. But for time, we're going to go into Acts 27. I'll read it in its entirety. It's quite lengthy, and that's why I had you seat yourselves. But if you looked at Joseph, you would see in Genesis 39 that he is simply living life. He's simply living life, and God uses him. Here in Acts 27, Paul is simply living his life, and we see how God uses him. I'll begin in Acts 27, the first verse. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, they proceeded to deliver Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking in an Adramyttian ship, which was about to sail to the regions along the coast of Asia, we put out to sea accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul with consideration and allowed him to go to his friends and receive care. From there we put out to sea and sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. When we had sailed through the sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy, and he put us aboard it. When we had sailed slowly for a good many days, and with difficulty had arrived off Cnidus, since the wind did not permit us to go further, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmon. And with difficulty sailing past it, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. When considerable time had passed, and the voyage was now dangerous, since even the fast was already over, Paul began to admonish them and said to them, "Men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." But the centurion was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship than by what was being said by Paul, because the harbor was not suitable for wintering. The majority reached a decision to put out to sea from there, if somehow they might reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. When a moderate south wind came up, supposing that they had attained their purpose, they weighed anchor and began sailing along Crete close inshore. But before very long, there rushed down from the land a violent land called Quillo. And when the ship was caught in it and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and let ourselves be driven along. Running under the shelter of a small island called Claudia, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. After they had hoisted it up, they used supporting cables and undergirding the ship, and fearing that they might run aground on the shallows of Syrtis, they let down the sea anchor, and in this way let themselves be driven along. The next day, as we were being violently storm-tossed, they began to jettison the cargo. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. Since neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small storm was assailing us, from then on, all hope of being saved was gradually abandoned. When they had gone a long time without food, then Paul stood up in their midst and said, "Men, you ought to have followed my advice and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this damage and loss. Yet now I urge you to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood before me, saying, 'Do not be afraid, Paul, you must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you.' Therefore, keep up your courage, men, for I believe God that it will turn out exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on a certain island." But when the 14th night came, as we were being driven about in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors began to surmise that we were approaching some land. They took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. And a little further on, they took another sounding and found it to be 15 fathoms. Fearing that we might run aground somewhere on the rocks, they cast 4 anchors from the stern and wished for daybreak. But as the sailors were trying to escape from the ship and had let down the ship's boat into the sea, on the pretense of intending to lay out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, "Unless these men remain in the ship, you yourselves cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it fall away. Until the day was about to dawn, Paul was encouraging them all to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have been constantly watching and going without food, having taken nothing. Therefore I encourage you to take some food, for this is for your preservation. For not a hair from the head of any of you will perish." Having said this, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all, and he broke it and began to eat. All of them were encouraged, and they themselves also took food. All of us in the ship were 276 persons. When they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing out the wheat into the sea. When day came, they could not recognize the land, but they did observe a bay with a beach, and they resolved to drive the ship onto it if they could. And casting off the anchors, they left them in the sea, while at the same time they were loosening the ropes of the rudders and hoisting the foresail to the wind. They were heading for the beach. But striking a reef, where 2 seas meet, they ran the vessel aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable, but the stern began to be broken up by the force of the waves. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, so that none of them would swim away and escape. But the centurion, wanting to bring Paul safely through, kept them from their intention and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land. And the rest should follow, some on planks and others on various things from the ship. And so it happened that they all were brought safely to land. The grass withers and the flower fades. But the word of our God stands forever. Children at this time are invited to children's church. Well, that only took 10 minutes to read. If I only preached 5 times as long, we'll be good. There is a lot of progression in this story this morning that we have to go through. But I titled the sermon today, "Does Your Life Matter?" I think oftentimes in the mundane routine of life, if we were to stop and think about it, we would wonder if what we are doing matters at all. Does what we are doing on a day in and day out basis have any eternal value? Is it having a positive effect on anyone around us? In our text today, we're going to be looking at Paul, who's traveled to Rome, as we just read, while he's a prisoner. And we'll notice in this text some exceptional things happening. But on average, we will see Paul just living his life. Think of Paul's situation in this chapter. He's a prisoner of Rome. He's in chains. He has no self-determination. And he's just one of a bunch of prisoners. He's on his way to Rome, and he travels on a couple different boats to get there, as we'll see. But these boats are full of sailors, hardened by the sea, full of soldiers, hardened by battle, and other prisoners hardened by life and by their decisions. Now, some people think that these prisoners, in fact, have been assigned to death and that they're on their way to Rome to fight in the Colosseum, because every province had an obligation to send prisoners to the Colosseum. That may be true. But these are the types of people that Paul's surrounded by. And he's just one of many. We might look at him and think, his life can't really matter. He couldn't really have any real influence in these circumstances. After all, he's on a mundane boat ride with all these hardened people. How often do we think this of our own lives? How often do we think we're just going through the motions? We're just riding the waves of life. Does life really matter? What we see in our passage today is that Jesus redeems us. And in this redemption, He is redeeming every area of our lives. He's taking everything we do, everything we think, and asserting His reign over it. He's making it to glorify Him. He's making it useful to Him. As Jesus goes about redeeming us, He's teaching us how to love others. He's giving us hope. And He's calling us to have faith in Him. Let's look at Paul's life in this passage. As we look at the first 8 verses, we're told about Paul's journey from Caesarea to Fair Havens. In the first verse, we are told that Paul's handed over to Julius, who was of the Augustan court. Paul's joined on this trip by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, and by Luke. This is one of the we passages, so Luke's including himself in the we. I want to look at a map to give us some understanding of where they journeyed. There's a lot on this map, I know. And for time, I'm not going to keep showing you maps. I'll show you one more. They start out here in Caesarea, go to Sidon, and then they come up, because of the wind, they hug the coast over to Cnidus, and then they come down hugging the coast and they stop in Fair Havens. So we will get to Malta today, but we won't know that it's Malta. So that's their trip. Now also, we have trouble in the United States, and I meant to put up a map. The size of this is from about North Carolina, clear out past Colorado, just for comparison of span. I actually have a map that overlays this on the United States. So this is a lot of length. But here we see Paul going from Caesarea up the coast to Sidon. Julius allows Paul to visit the believers there. No doubt he had a Roman soldier with him when he took that trip. And we're told in verse 3 that Julius treated Paul with consideration. Why might he have done this? Is it because Paul's a Roman citizen? Is it because of Paul's reputation in Caesarea while he was imprisoned there? Is it because Agrippa and Festus believed that he was innocent, so he told the centurion to treat him well? We aren't told, but all of these probably come into play somehow in how Paul is treated. Notice they sail under the shelter of Cyprus, and we're told because the winds were contrary. Paying attention to the wind in this section is important. Then they sailed along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia until they came to Myra. And that's where we stopped for a couple minutes. In Myra, they change ships and they get on an Alexandrian ship. And that fact will be important in a few minutes. Paul includes details because they're pertinent. But one of the things we know is Alexandria was the breadbasket of Rome, supplying Rome's wheat and a third of their corn. Then we go to verse 7. And it tells us that when we had sailed slowly for a good many days and with difficulty had arrived at Cnidus, since the wind did not permit us to go further, we sailed under the shelter of Crete of Solomon. And with difficulty sailing past it, we came to a place called Fair Havens. So we're in Crete at this point. Notice in the text how many times Luke has referred to the wind. It's hindering their progress. It's significant. It's a battle. So here they are in Fair Havens, and they remain there for a considerable time. Then Luke notes in verse 9 that the voyage was now dangerous. It hasn't been dangerous to now, but now it's dangerous. It's been dangerous the whole time. And it's dangerous because it's so late in the year. And how late is it in the year? It's so late that the fast has already occurred. And what Luke is saying here is that the fast, which is the Day of Atonement, which that year occurred on October 5th of the year 59, it was late because it was understood that it became very dangerous to sail in the Mediterranean Sea after September 15th. And all sailing ceased totally from November 11th to March 10th. They are in the bad season. They are literally bumping up against November 11th. Now we begin to see the interpersonal dialogue in verse 9. We read, Paul began to admonish them and said to them, Men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo in the ship, but also of our lives. Now, who is Paul to have an opinion on this? He doesn't own the ship. He's not a pilot. He's not a captain. Well, it is estimated that Paul has sailed over 3,500 miles in the course of his ministry. He's been around. He knows the calendar. He knows that the whole Mediterranean is about to shut down. And he has just experienced, along with the rest of the guys, the difficulty to get to where they are because of the winds. It's not going to get better. And Paul has been something of a leader of the ship. He's been treated especially kind by the Romans. He has two men serving him, Aristarchus and Luke. That gives him prestige in that culture. Paul is making his position known. He's not claiming a special knowledge from God. God didn't say this. This is Paul's own experience and wisdom being put out. But then we see in verse 11, we hear the counter position. But the centurion was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship than by what was being said by Paul. Now this is where the Alexandrian ship really comes in. Rome likes stability. In order to have stability, you have to have food security. The food came from Alexandria. When the ships would sail late in the year, when it was dangerous, they were paid extra for their cargo because Rome wanted that wheat for stability. Rome also paid for ships that were wrecked in the process of trying to get them grain late in the year. So the owner of the boat is not really taking on risk here. The pilot and the captain have financial incentive to get to Rome at this time of year. Then we read in verse 12. Because the harbor was not suitable for wintering, the majority reached a decision to put out to sea from there if somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete facing southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. The majority are saying, look, we want to go to Phoenix. It's only 50 miles away, maybe a little less. We can stay there for the winter. We can't stay where we're at right now. We cannot winter here. We have to go somewhere. Let's go to Phoenix, 50 miles. Now I want to think about what Paul is feeling and thinking. We know that Paul has a desire to go to Rome. He's the one who appealed to Caesar. God has told him he's going to go to Rome. It's his goal. He's not trying to stop from going to Rome. Yet his experience tells him that continuing on is not wise. But he's overruled. He's not the one in power. How do you think he acted after he was rebuffed? Rebuffed by over half of the crew. You know, Paul had written the book of Romans just a short time before this. And he writes in Romans 13, verse 1, "Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves." Paul knew this principle of subjugation to the authorities, to those in charge. Surely he was willingly living in subjection to the Roman centurion. He knew the pecking order. Or maybe he thought of what he wrote in Philippians 2, verse 3. "Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others." Or maybe Paul thought of what he wrote in Galatians 5:19. "The deeds of the flesh are evident, which are strife, jealousy, outbursts of anger, disputes, dissensions, and factions." Surely Paul, who said, "Follow me as I follow Christ," knew the pitfalls of his attitude in reaction to this situation. He didn't want to live according to the flesh. So here's my point. Paul didn't make up these verses. He was directed by Jesus to write them. Jesus is the one who calls us to act like him. When we act like him, we're taught how to love our neighbors. We're taught how to love our neighbors as ourselves. When we obey Jesus, our lives are redeemed and used by him for his purposes. Jesus redeems us by teaching us how to love him and how to love our neighbors in really hard situations. Now the story progresses to show us the hope that we have in Jesus. We're told in verse 13, "A moderate south wind came up." They see this as their opportunity to make a break for Phoenix. The wind's low, let's go. And they start sailing close to Crete. So they're protected from the north winds should the winds shift by Crete itself. But all of a sudden, a violent wind rushes down the mountains off of Crete to the ship. They literally call this a nor'easter. It's not just something we've come up with in the United States. Back then, this was called a nor'easter. It's a hurricane force wind that comes on this ship. And they can't fight it, so they decide to just let it carry them along. Then at one point, they desperately try to regain control by going to the little island of Claudia. And at the same time, they decide to bring the dinghy that's floating behind the ship up onto the ship because it's just being tossed everywhere. It's probably going to sink if they leave it back there. And they bring it up with great effort. Then they try to strengthen the ships, and we're not sure what this means. It could have meant putting ropes under the ship to pull it tight. Could have meant putting ropes from one side of the top of the ship to the other to pull the deck together. We're not sure, but they're trying to strengthen the boat. Then they let their anchor down in case they come upon land. The anchor will hit before the ship hits. Then the next day, they begin throwing cargo overboard. Then the third day, They threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. That statement has to be there because it's significant. This tackle could have been the various tools they used to guide the ship, to control the ship. Could have been all kinds of things. We're not exactly sure. But it was a significant sacrifice. They are desperate. They are doing everything they can to lighten the ship, to keep it from sinking. Verse 20. Since neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small storm was assailing us, from then on, all hope of being saved was gradually abandoned. This is the first time that Luke has used the word save or saved in our text today. All the events that have preceded this have found their conclusion in this loss of hope. All the difficulty, all the difficulty of this journey, this fight to survive has come to a head. There's no hope. They don't know where they are. The sun and stars have not been seen for days. They've dumped all their valuable stuff over the side of the ship with their own hands. They're lost. They're desperate. And they're hopeless. Now enters God. Verse 21. We're told they hadn't eaten in a long time. Everyone's hungry, wet, exhausted, chilled to the bone. And Paul stands up and reminds them of his advice from the get-go not to take this journey. And then he continues in verse 22. Yet now I urge you to keep up your courage. For there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night, an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I serve, stood before me, saying, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you. Therefore keep up your courage, men, for I believe God that it will turn out exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on a certain island. He doesn't know what island, but on an island. Paul is now bringing God to bear on this situation, on this disaster. Paul is saying that in this particular circumstance, God is going to save everyone because God has told him he will do it. Why would they believe Paul? Could it be because of his behavior throughout this entire ordeal? Could it go back to his obedience that we looked at in the first point, that has gained him credibility with the people on the ship? Could it be because of how he has conducted himself in love for his neighbor? Could it be because all the men see God at work in the life of Paul himself? Paul brings everyone in the middle of this crisis to consider God and his relationship to what is happening. It is no doubt a stepping stone for Paul, for him telling them the gospel of Jesus Christ. But first he has to tell them about the God who controls the universe. Jenny and I, on our way home from Mississippi the other day, listened to a podcast by Dan Doriani, one of my seminary professors, interviewing Tim Challies. Tim Challies had a son who died suddenly. Unexplainable. He said at that time he had to take all of his theology and ask, does this make a difference to my life? Does this theology that I say I believe apply to this situation right here, right now? He decided it did. It had to. As we ourselves go through the valley of the shadow of death, or we walk through the valley with others, is our theology going to make a difference? Are we going to point ourselves, or are we going to point others to Christ, to Jesus as the only hope there is in this life? We see Paul do this as all hope is lost from the people on this boat. If we have loved our neighbors well, as Jesus would have us do, we will probably have the opportunity to introduce them to the God of hope, to the one who redeems every situation, the one who redeems every area of his people's lives. Will we bring God to bear in the difficulties of our lives? Will we find our hope in him alone? Now I want to finish up with verses 27 through 44. Here we find the sailors, after 14 days of drifting, they finally sense that there's land that they're sailing towards. And to prevent the ship from running aground on the rocks, they lower 4 anchors off the back of the boat. Then some sailors put a lifeboat down, or the dinghy down, acting as if they're going to go put more anchors off the front of the boat. But in reality, they're trying to escape the boat. Paul sees this and tells the centurion that everyone has to stay on the boat in order for God to rescue them. The centurion trusts Paul. He has the ropes cut to this lifeboat so it sails off on its own. He has those ropes cut so that God can save them, not the boat. Paul next encourages everyone to eat. They haven't eaten much of anything for 14 days. They're in survival mode. They're scared to death. You can also imagine the seasickness going on. Paul again tells them that eating will help preserve them, and he assures them that not a hair of their head will perish. Paul has confidence in what God has said. Paul then takes bread and gives thanks to God for it in the presence of everyone. And he breaks it and begins to eat, which leads everyone else to take the bread and eat. When all 276 people have had enough to eat, they begin throwing the wheat into the sea. And now I want to stop right there and think about what I just said. Okay, imagine we're all on this boat. We have had incredibly rough seas for at least 14 days. We have thrown cargo overboard, along with the ship's tackle. We haven't seen a star. We haven't seen the sun for days. We don't know where we are in this vast sea, this vast ocean, if you will. We don't know for sure if we will even make it out alive. It doesn't look like we will. Now Paul wants everyone to eat to strengthen themselves. And he assures them that they're not going to die. Well, look around, Paul. I think we are. Then he takes the bread and gives thanks to God. Where has God been all these days and these nights when we needed him? Paul, you seem so confident in this God of yours. Why? Surely Paul would have said, because he told me he would save us all. Because God has always been faithful to his promises, all through my life in the past. Verse 39, day comes and they see land, a bay with a beach, and they seek to drive the ship up onto the land. They cut the anchors, raise the sail, and they immediately hit a reef. They're stuck. They can't get off it. Not only can they not get off it, now the ship's falling apart. The ship isn't needed any longer. And now the soldiers, they know that if a prisoner escapes, they're dead. They'd rather the prisoners be dead, so they seek to kill them. But God causes the centurion to want to save Paul. And how do we know that God causes that? Because God has promised Paul he'll be in Rome. He will protect him from the Jews and the Gentiles. Then the centurion has those who can swim, swim. Others grab hold of something and ride it to shore. You had to know they were scared to death. There was no plan B. Then Luke concludes in verse 44. And so it happened that they were all brought safely to land. What he means is that this is how God fulfilled his promise to them. Throughout this whole ordeal, the Gentiles were trying to save themselves by their own strength. And they were doing what one should do. What one should do in these circumstances, making the ship lighter and such. But it was Paul who brought God into the conversation, who sought to live based on the promises that God had given him. And we see that God was faithful to his promises. How many times do we find ourselves in hard, really hard circumstances where we're doing everything that we should be doing? We're doing it right. But we fail to bring God into the situation. How many times do we speak with our neighbors, our co-workers, our family members about hard things they're going through? And then we realize that we aren't looking to God for help. Do we have the boldness to bring God to bear on the situation? Do we have the faithfulness and trust to bring God into the situation? Do we know what it means to live by faith in Jesus? He hasn't sent his angel to tell us the outcome of our problems, but he has made us promises. In Zechariah, God says that the one who touches his people touches the apple of his eye. In Romans, he tells us that nothing can separate us from him and his love for us. He tells us that he works all things out for our good, for the good of those who love him. He has given us so many promises. Do we believe him? Jesus calls us to have faith in him. God gave Paul something of an inside track in a hard situation here, by making known to him that everyone on the ship would be saved. There are many, many life situations we find ourselves in where we have no clue what God's going to do. We have no clue how the situation is going to resolve. But today we come to celebrate the main promise of Jesus to his people, that he will indeed redeem us fully. He will indeed keep us for eternity, no matter the problems we go through. He will indeed be with us. And he will redeem every part of us. And he will redeem creation itself. In the Lord's Supper, he teaches us to love one another, to live in the hope of eternity, and to live by faith in what he has said. Let's pray. Father, we are so grateful for the promises that you have given us that assure us that we are yours, that you love us, that we will be with you in eternity, that we will know perfection. We will know life without sin and pain and hurt. Help us to trust you in the difficult situations in life. Help us to bring you to bear in every situation we find ourselves in, or the ones around us that you've given us a ministry to. May we know that you are good. May we communicate to others that you are good, you're in control, and you have a perfect plan. We thank you for redeeming us. Give us faith. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.